What is going on, everyone? Welcome into another edition of the 415ers podcast, as always on the Odyssey Sports Podcast Network with 95.7 The Game, coming at you twice a week here in the offseason, in the thick of the offseason before the beginning of those kind of mandatory, but not really mandatory camps that the 49ers start on Monday. A lot to get to as far as the quarterbacks, the upcoming NFL draft next Thursday, as well as maybe some talk about the future. But before we dig into all that, Marc, Grandi, Evan Giddings with you as always. Marc, my man, how are you?
I'm doing well. We're what? We record this Wednesday evening. You're probably listening to it Thursday. So if you're listening to it Thursday, a week away from the NFL draft, we're finally getting there. It's wild. It doesn't even feel like it's been that long since the Niners last played a football game, but it has been quite a while. I'm looking forward to the NFL draft. I'm excited to get some draft talk in today. There's just been too much quarterback drama to dive into it a ton. I guess what we have some more quarterback drama to get to. But overall, I'm doing well, Evan. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty good. Yeah. Also want to give a shout out to everyone who is towards the end of Ramadan. That comes up as everyone is listening on Thursday.
Good call.
I apologize, but I just had a bowl full of ham soup. So apologize to those that eat pork, and I do love me some swine. But of course, everyone here that listen to the 415ers podcast, we are inclusive, we are loving, and we appreciate you tuning in. I'm doing pretty well, Marc, and I think that look, this week has been interesting for those Bay Area sports fans, of course, in the thick of the NBA playoffs.
Yeah.
Things are not looking great for the Warriors. For those who follow baseball, things have not looked great for the San Francisco Giants to start their season. And right now, things are not looking good if you're a San Francisco 49ers fan for Trey Lance, because every single piece of news or rumor that has been floated, over the past month or month and a half, honestly, has signaled towards some sort of movement or some sort of disbelief in this guy. And that continues this week, Marc, because as we're recording on Wednesday, there's a report from Mike Florio, Pro Football Talk, basically confirming what he had originally, I think, alluded to a little while ago at the scouting combine, which was the 49ers and the Vikings may or may not have been talking about trading Trey Lance and trying to make a deal. But in fact, that was essentially confirmed today. And from what I was reading, essentially the 49ers fielding calls on Trey Lance in Indianapolis was about the worst kept secret at the NFL Combine. And so I'll just throw it to you, Marc. I mean, the 49ers are taking calls on this guy. I don't know if it comes as a shock, but how did you see it?
Yeah, I'm not surprised. Again, we've been talking about this a lot. I think it's an absolute mistake, and it would be a terrible move for the 49ers to pull the trigger on Trey Lance. But it just seems like they are okay with doing it. You mentioned, the worst kept secret at the scouting combine. John Lynch literally answered a question about a potential, package in return, compensation for a Trey Lance trade. Like, that happened. That was an actual question and an actual answer. Now, again, yeah, literally every player, no matter how good, how accomplished, they have a price. I mean, at some point, everyone has a price. And Trey Lance is very, not accomplished. He's done absolutely nothing in the NFL. So there's, of course, a price there. But the fact that the 49ers are openly talking about that over a month ago now, I think means something. And now you get this report from multiple respected media members. Ian Rappaport is talking about it on NFL Network on Wednesday morning. You also have, I think, an important caveat is the 49ers are not the ones making the calls themselves. It's other teams calling the 49ers, which, okay, the Niners aren't being incredibly aggressive in shopping Trey Lance, but they're still shopping Trey Lance. They're taking calls. They're negotiating. They're trying to get the best price back on it. So when I woke up to this news, when I logged on to Twitter for the first time, I was not surprised, Evan. I'm not sure how you feel. I'm not surprised the Niners are doing this. I'm firmly in the camp that they shouldn't be doing it, but I'm not surprised given everything that we've heard over the last couple of months.
No, again, I do not think Trey Lance will be traded. I personally would not trade Trey Lance.
I agree with you on that part.
However, if you're the 49ers, based on their body language, this doesn't come as a surprise because nothing about their comments, the way that either they've used Trey Lance or they've spoken about Trey Lance since Brock Purdy has entered the fold would tell you that their confidence is sky high in this guy. And so the next logical step would be another team doing its due diligence. And according to Ian Rappaport and Mike Flory and other sources around the NFL, several teams have inquired about Trey Lance's services. And the 49ers, I guess you could say it would be negligent not to pick up the phone and at least ask. Now, the question is, could the price of Trey Lance actually drive him out of town? And that's where I have a hard time believing that he will get traded, because I don't see Trey Lance's value as particularly high right now. And I don't think the 49ers would be willing to move off of him for beans. And right now, that's probably the best that you're going to get. And when I mean beans, I mean a late round pick. I mean, maybe some cash, a throwaway player, nothing of value that is going to make the 49ers, who selected this guy third overall a few years ago, want to move off of him. So I still contend that I don't think he's going anywhere, but that doesn't mean that the 49ers should not at least hear people out. And again, like you mentioned, they're not the ones making the calls, but I understand why they're taking them.
I do think it was an important part of that report to get that out. The Niners weren't the ones making the calls. This doesn't mean that they aren't making calls. It just means that this current report says that they're not. They still very well could be. The reality of the situation is we don't know. If they are actively making calls and actively shopping Trey Lance, which if they believe trading him is the right thing to do, then they probably are, because as you and I both agree, this is the one thing that we do agree on in this regard. If they do trade him, Evan, it'll likely be before or during the draft. Like it's not going to be after the draft. So they're almost, running out of time. Of course, there's a week left. There's still plenty of things that happen, and there's so much business that happens on draft day itself. A lot of times you kind of need that deadline to push things forward. But if the 49ers have decided, okay, we're going to trade Trey Lance, it's not working here. We just got to cut bait and move on. We're happy with Brock Purdy, despite the fact that he's coming off of a major elbow injury. We got to move on. Time is of the essence for the 49ers. So, Evan, I would not be shocked personally if the 49ers are actually making some calls themselves as well. Or in the coming days, it gets to a point where they say, hey, we got to push this thing along and we got to try to go out and be the aggressors in this potential trade market or search. Maybe it's not happening yet, but I would not be surprised if it doesn't happen, or if I wouldn't be surprised if it does happen at some point soon.
Well, then let's kind of discuss the next step of this, Mark, because if the trade does go through, I think you and I both agree that the draft would be the best time to do it, because
Yeah.
then you have a chance to select whoever's going to be that third quarterback, or at least set yourself up in this offseason to maybe sign who's ever going to be that third quarterback for you. The Vikings are the name that has been thrown around since the combine. I'm curious if you think that any other team, and a couple of them come to my mind, would want Trey Lance at this point. I mean, the Tennessee Titans have been linked to Trey Lance, Ron Carthan, and his relationship with Lance, and of course the 49ers. I don't know if the Houston Texans have an interest. There's been some reports about them maybe not wanting to draft a quarterback. And so D'Amico Ryans, who's now over there, could potentially, sort of buck that top draft pick trend and try and make a trade for Trey Lance. That top draft pick wouldn't be going to San Francisco. But I'm curious where you think that Trey Lance could potentially land, in my opinion, if the Niners are dumb enough to move him.
I think there's a specific team profile that you have to consider, and I'm not sure the Vikings fit it. I think the Vikings are still in a spot, Evan. I know that they have some questions this offseason. I mean, I know Dalvin Cook, we don't know where he's going to end up. And they have some other, guys who you're not really sure if they're going to be back or not. I think generally speaking, the teams that want to acquire Trey Lance are teams that aren't quite ready to compete legitimately yet. Um, the Titans are kind of in that mold, but I would say more like the Texans. I think you're spot on with the Texans. They have the number 2 overall pick. They are still very young. They have some nice pieces. They have a rookie head coach, as you mentioned, who has connections, of course, to Trey Lance. I think that's the dream spot, not necessarily for Trey Lance, but for the Texans. That would be perfect. Of course, if they fall in love or if they have fallen in love with a quarterback in this draft process, maybe they're predisposed to not try to acquire Trey Lance. But if they still think Trey Lance can be something and they can use that second overall pick to either move back and have a quarterback needy team give them a surplus of picks to take the number 2 overall pick, or if they just draft the best available non-quarterback and given the Texans roster, they could use almost every position. That could be a gigantic road forward for the Texans. Get your young quarterback via a trade who's already in the NFL in Trey Lance and use your bounty of picks on other positions. And that could really spring your franchise forward. So for me, Evan, if I were to make a bet that the 49ers are trading Trey Lance, I would say it's to the Houston Texans.
And I would say if the Houston Texans don't use the number 2 pick on a quarterback, that would be negligent. Like, especially because I think there's some good ones at the top of this draft. And I also I don't think anyone knows what Trey Lance is. Now, maybe Miko Ryans has faith in him and he's got a 6-year deal. So he's got a little bit of time to play with. And Trey Lance has, a high ceiling, so to speak. I do agree that that mold of team is where Trey Lance would fit best. I'm just not sure there are enough GMs out there in those situations that are picking that high in the draft that would be willing to take a chance that early on Trey Lance. And who knows? I mean, maybe the Texans draft a quarterback and also try and make a trade for Trey Lance, and then they put their eggs into multiple baskets. I'm not sure. It's just, to me, it's another reason why I don't see him leaving is because everyone at the top of the draft, if we're just going down Carolina, they're probably going to take a quarterback number 1. Houston, again, I would think that they would take a quarterback at number 2. Arizona doesn't need a quarterback, even though they don't currently have one because he's got an ACL tear. The Indianapolis Colts potentially could need a quarterback, but I mean, they're also closer to being in win now mode than a team like the Texans. Seattle doesn't need a quarterback. The Lions don't need a quarterback. The Raiders just got the 49ers quarterback. The Falcons, I just don't see in those top kind of 10 areas where teams that are in the process or close to rebuilding in need of a guy like Trey Lance. And so if they're the ones making calls to the 49ers are picking up and say, hey, we're probably looking at a third and a fourth that we'd like for Trey Lance. And we spent multiple first rounders on this guy. If I'm one of those teams, I'm saying, hey, I'm sorry, I can't do that. The only reason to me why the Vikings would make sense is because Kirk Cousins' contract becomes avoidable at the end of this next year. I'm not saying it would be a swap, but the Vikings might be able to work something out to where they could pay a little of a heftier price for a quarterback in waiting. But then you're also looking at Trey Lance saying, well, he's got to wait another year anyway. And then he's really going to be on his last year of his rookie deal. So that's kind of head scratching. And then the 49ers might just say, well, why not just keep him in the first place? Like there's too many what ifs surrounding Trey in both his value and, of course, the player himself for me to see him leaving. At least that's where I'm coming from.
Yeah, one other thought here before we move on. When it comes to a potential trade with, for example, the Texans, like we're talking about, one thing that I think makes that tough for the 49ers is because the Texans are drafting so high in the draft. The assumption, at least in my opinion, would be if they were to acquire Trey Lance, they would be moving off the number 2 overall pick because you could get great value from a team that desperately needs a quarterback and can hop up second overall. They're not going to pick, a defensive tackle, an edge rusher 2 overall when you could get great value even for moving back just a couple of spots in the draft. So let's assume a couple of things. The Niners trade Trey Lance, and it's to a team in the top 5 of the draft. That team is likely going to have to make the decision and actually acquire Trey Lance Thursday, the day of round 1 of the NFL draft, because they need to figure out what they're doing with their pick in the top 5. And it just seems more likely, Evan, that if the 49ers were to trade Trey Lance, it probably happens day 2 of the NFL draft, when, of course, all of the top picks have already happened. It seems to be a move that the Niners call, I'm just throwing out a name, the Cleveland Browns in the second round or whatever it is, and they say, hey, we would really love this pick. Are you interested in Trey Lance? That was a bad example. Cleveland Browns have their quarterback set up for a while.
Yeah.
But that's, I think, generally how this probably works more. There's just an extra hurdle to jump if you're trading to a team that is picking that early, even if you're not getting that number 5 overall pick, which of course the Niners wouldn't in a Trey Lance trade. It's just an extra hurdle to jump over because it has to happen likely before that team's pick in the top 5.
All good points. We'll see. Got about a week until the NFL draft, and a week potentially until Trey Lance is no longer a San Francisco 49er.